Hey guys, tonight we're starting with something a little darker, but definitely just as fascinating. What it was like to be a criminal in the Middle Ages. Spoiler, it wasn't great. Whether you stole a loaf of bread, insulted the wrong noble, or just looked suspicious, the consequences could get creative. From public shaming to brutal torture methods that make modern punishments look like a spa day, we're going to take a slow walk through the many reasons you wouldn't have lasted more than 24 hours with a bad reputation back then. So before we ease into all that medieval madness, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always such a joy to see the little nighttime map of viewers light up. Now, get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, pull up your blanket, turn on a quiet fan or some soft background noise, and let's gently drift back to a time when crime didn't pay, but it definitely made history. When we think of crime and punishment in the medieval period, we often think of a chaotic system of judgment and brutal punishments that seem out of proportion with the seriousness of the crime. In medieval Europe, law and order was harsh. It was assumed that people would only behave well if they feared the penalty of breaking the law. There was a gibbet on the outskirts of most towns in England. There, criminals would be hanged, their bodies left to rot for many weeks as a stark warning as to the reality of breaking the law. However, this obviously wasn't the great deterrent that the establishment hoped it would be. In just 1 year, the northern city of Lincoln had 114 murders, 89 robberies with violence, and 65 woundings. Considering Lincoln had a population of just 7,000 people in 1202, those numbers seem quite high. And when you also consider that only 2 people were executed for these crimes, it would seem that a lot of medievals were getting away with their offences. Blasphemy. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church was a dominant force, and many countries maintained order by imposing religious or canon laws on the people, as well as those decided by the monarch. Refusing to acknowledge God or offering up any ideas not sanctioned by the Church was considered to be blasphemous. The Dominican friar and philosopher Thomas Aquinas amazingly considered blasphemy, quote, a sin more grave than murder, because it was directed against God rather than against one's neighbour. This view was also considered true by the medieval leaders of Islam too. In Kuwait, punishment was as brutal as it could get, with stoning, burning at the stake, or having an elephant crush your head being the standard penalty. Across medieval Europe, there were many terrible punishments for the offence, including garroting in Spain, mutilation in Germany, and flogging or branding in England. Unfortunately, it was very easy to commit the sin of blasphemy. Just a tiny slip in the company of the wrong person could result in someone suddenly becoming an unwitting criminal. Murder. Why the Middle Ages in Europe was so violent has often been debated. Historians have argued that almost everyone had witnessed a murder or knew someone who had been killed. It claimed that in the Oxford or London of the medievals, you were more likely to be murdered than die by accident. Getting away from the scene of the crime after a murder was quite easy. There were large areas of woodland and countryside between urban settlements in medieval Europe, giving the perpetrator the perfect opportunity to flee the scene, and the chances of getting caught were small. Law enforcement was practically non-existent, although some Italian city-states were lucky enough to have salaried police officers. Theft. The medievals stole for many reasons, just as people do so today. Theft was probably one of the most common crimes committed during the Middle Ages. Just like murderers, the medieval thief could easily slip away unnoticed. How crimes were perceived and the severity of the punishment given seemed to depend on where the offence was committed. In 1353, in the village of Mihavel, southern France, a woman was washing her clothes in the local stream, leaving the items to dry on a frame. She returned to find that her cloak had been stolen. A young man of 15 was arrested for the crime. A few days later, he was found guilty of the theft at court, and he was banished from the village for 3 months. In the London of 1417, a man named Edmund H. Chappell from the district of Finsbury was indicted for the robbery of a horse, 4 bolts of cloth, and some other goods. He was found guilty by a jury and sentenced to hang. The crimes are quite similar, but the punishments are worlds apart. It would seem that there were huge variations in what penalties were deemed appropriate depending on the location. In 1321, the Warrant family were making a nuisance of themselves in the rural village of Seoul in Norfolk, England. Firstly, 3 of the siblings, sisters Marjorie and Matilda, along with brother Richard, were accused of stealing goods. They managed to evade punishment, along with another sister who was accused of theft. Later in the same year, however, a 5th family member named John was found guilty of stealing clothes and other goods worth 8 shillings from a neighbour. At a time when the average labourer was earning 3 pennies a day, 8 shillings was worth on average a month's wages. It would seem that the Warrants were making a considerable living from their illegal activities. Unfortunately, stealing anything worth over 12 pence was seen as a serious crime, and John was hanged. Undeterred by the fate of their relative, the Warrants were back in trouble with the law again in 1325. This time, all 4 of the siblings were behind bars to await trial for stealing cloth worth 60 shillings, and the jailer was specifically instructed to inflict them with fortet jus, or strong and hard treatment, which probably meant some form of torture. But working together again, they managed to escape conviction. When put before a jury the following year, they were at it again. In February, the family were indicted for the theft of 32 cloths, and in August, the 2 sisters were accused of stealing another 40 shillings worth. They were all acquitted on both occasions. There is no way of knowing how many other crimes the family committed, or how they kept getting away with it. When they were brought before a court, we can only assume that they either gave up their life of crime, or were never caught again, because they disappeared into the mists of medieval obscurity. It is surprising that the family was never actually convicted of any crimes, especially when we consider that the guilt of a suspect on trial in the Middle Ages was usually dependent on the reputation and character of the prisoner rather than evidence. Trials were very quick affairs, without the lengthy questioning of witnesses and drawn-out deliberations that we see today. Corruption. In 1249, some merchants from the Belgian province of Brabant complained to King Henry III that they had been robbed whilst conducting business in the county of Hampshire. Hampshire was a busy, thriving place, being home to the port of Southampton and the Palace of Winchester. The suspects were caught, put on trial, but acquitted. However, the merchants persisted in their complaint. King Henry took instruction from his councillors and was not happy to find that attacks on travellers were common in Hampshire, and there was a conspiracy to hide the crime from the justices, which involved jurors who were actually accomplices of the robbers. It seems that corruption was a huge problem, and many gangs had links to the rich and powerful, including knights and members of the nobility. The dishonesty went right to the very top. In 1350, Sir William Thorpe, the Chief Justice of the King's Bench, was jailed for accepting bribes. Perhaps this is why the Warrants were never convicted, and why jury after jury found them innocent, despite their previous form and bad reputation. It's possible that they were involved in a conspiracy and sharing their stolen money with the very jurors who were deciding their fate, finding sanctuary. Of course, if you were a convicted criminal and you could make it to a church, you could always claim sanctuary. In medieval Europe, the most common crimes for which a fugitive would seek sanctuary were theft and murder. Once the outlaw was inside a cathedral or church, they were safe, as their pursuers were forbidden to enter by law. The felon could even take a bow, an arrow, or any other weapon into the church to attack their pursuers from the windows. Once safe inside, the hope was that an agreement might be reached with the injured party, and the offender would be given safe passage to leave. Unlike most European churches, where a person could only stay in sanctuary for 40 days, for the English there was no limit. In 12th century England, anyone claiming sanctuary had to go into permanent exile from their country, and could only return if given a royal pardon. Sanctuary followed by exile was better than going to prison. The food inside jail was bad and scarce, and disease was rife. Not many made it out alive. There were severe penalties for anyone who broke the laws of sanctuary. In 1284, Ralph of Aldgate was out walking with his mistress Alice at Bow, when a goldsmith named Lawrence Duquette insulted her and called her a fallen woman. Ouch! The two men began to fight, and Ralph was badly injured. Fearing that he would die, Lawrence fled to the church of St Mary Le Bow nearby. Ralph actually survived, but Lawrence was later found hanging inside the church. Believing he had committed suicide because of guilt, his body was cut down, and he was thrown into a ditch to rot. But a witness came forward who was hiding inside the church and had seen Alice and a group of Ralph's friends enter St Mary's and lynch Lawrence, hanging him from one of the mullions above a window. This was clearly a violation of the conditions of sanctuary, and the perpetrators were punished accordingly. Alice was burned at the stake, which was the usual method of execution for a murderess, and her 15 male co-conspirators were hanged. Self-killing. The body of poor Lawrence was treated with such contempt because the act of suicide was also seen as a crime. From as early as the 6th century, the Catholic Church viewed it as a form of murder and denied a suicide victim their formal funeral rite. By the 12th century, this so-called self-murder was seen as a crime in civil law as well as in religious law in Europe. Because it deprived a feudal lord of one of his chattels, the victim's property and belongings would be confiscated for the king's treasury instead of being given to the suicide's family. In early 15th century France, the law called for the house of a suicide victim to be demolished, his fields burned, and his woods chopped down. As if that wasn't enough, the body of a suicide victim, who was seen as nothing but a common criminal, would often be tortured. Some would be hanged or dragged through the streets by a horse, and others burned as a warning of the absolute atrocity of self-murder. In England, a suicide was buried at the crossroads, with a stake through the heart to pin the corpse to the ground. Bizarrely, it was thought that this would prevent the spirit from returning and causing any more mayhem. If the staking failed to hold the soul, then it would hopefully get confused by the crossroads and choose the wrong road, thereby going off to harass some other village or town. The actual amount of unlawful behaviour that occurred during the Middle Ages is hard to calculate, but as many social mischiefs were also criminalised, such as gambling, scolding, vagrancy, sexual offences and even eavesdropping, it would seem to be a time when both church and state were trying to gain social control over even the tiniest of wrongdoings. In the 1300s in northern France, a nasty character named Jacquemont bribed a jailer to let his unwanted son-in-law die a painful death in prison. Jacquemont then, with the help of his son, killed his nephew, Collart Cordel. The impoverished Cordel had followed Jacquemont during the harvest, trying to glean the wheat from behind him, but angered his uncle by coming too close. Jacquemont grabbed his nephew by his hood, hurled him brutally to the ground and spurred his horse to ride again and again over the crumpled body. It's an episode that might have been lifted from Game of Thrones. No wonder the era has become a byword for brutality. Indeed, during a brutal scene in the film Pulp Fiction, one of the characters menaces that, "I'm going to get medieval on your ass." There's no need to explain what this might involve because the stereotype of the violent, sadistic Middle Ages is well known to all of us. But how accurate is this stereotype? As the Jacquemont episode shows, there is plenty that is shocking and disturbing in the surviving records for the later Middle Ages. But even more striking is that medieval contemporaries were also horrified by such events. Of course, we only know about this case because it provoked a legal reaction. It wasn't seen as acceptable or even normal. Levels of interpersonal violence were certainly higher in the Middle Ages than today, but it's very hard to quantify this precisely, even more so if we add war and the horrors of genocide into the equation. In part, this is because the changing nature of legal prosecutions means that we are not comparing like with like. Definitions of criminal violence have also changed. For example, rape and domestic violence were defined very narrowly in the Middle Ages. The historian Lawrence Stone calculated that homicide levels in medieval England were at least 10 times what they are today. Certainly we cannot doubt that it was a dangerous time in which to live. An exceptional case, even by medieval standards, is provided by 14th century Oxford. Levels of violence there were considered unacceptably high by contemporaries. In the 1340s, the homicide rate was around 110 per 100,000. In the UK in 2011, it was 1 per 100,000. Why were levels of interpersonal violence so high in the Middle Ages? Historians have offered various explanations. Steven Pinker has put forward a psychological theory, claiming that humankind learned only recently to tame its most savage impulses. But this doesn't really account for the complexity of reactions to violence in the medieval period, as we shall see. Others have pointed to the prevalence of alcohol and the fact that many people were wandering around armed with daggers and other knives on a daily basis. There were no permanent police forces as there are now, and in many cases the capture of a perpetrator depended on the cooperation of the community. Moreover, in an era of rudimentary medical care, many died from wounds that might today be successfully treated. There are more complex explanations too. These were cultures in which honour was paramount and violence was recognised as a means of communicating certain messages. If you hacked off a woman's nose, for example, most people would recognise this as a signifier of adultery. They were also profoundly unequal cultures, characterised, particularly from the 14th century, by high levels of social unrest. Sociologists and historians have been able to demonstrate a correlation between levels of inequality and levels of violence, which is particularly compelling for late medieval Europe. Homicides varied from premeditated attacks to tavern brawls that ended in disaster. Often these were over-exuberant episodes gone horribly wrong. In 1304, for example, one Gerlach de Wetzlaria, provost of a church in the Diocese of Salzburg, applied for a pardon for killing a fellow student many years earlier when a playful sword fight had ended in tragedy. Carrying out acts of violence seems to have been as much about proving oneself in front of one's peers and belonging to a group as it was about the victim, which probably explains why men in gangs were responsible for much of the mayhem. This sense of fraternity characterises a group of men led by Robert Stafford. Stafford was a chaplain. Perhaps because of his clerical status, he wittily named himself Frere Tuck, after the figure from the Robin Hood legends. His gang's actions mostly took the form of poaching and offences against property, though there were more brutal undertones. Apparently, they threatened the gamekeepers with death or mutilation. Female victims. It is much rarer to find women perpetrating violent crime. More often they were the victims. It is very difficult to assess levels of rape because the offence was subject to changing definitions, most of which would appear far too narrow to our modern eyes. Women had to be able to physically demonstrate their lack of consent and risk their reputations and punishment themselves in doing so. The odds were loaded against them. Cases that were eventually reported tended to be particularly brutal. In 1438, one Thomas Elam attacked Margaret Perman. He broke into her house, attempted to rape her, and feloniously bit Margaret with his teeth, so that he ripped off the nose of the said Margaret with that bite and broke 3 of her ribs there. The case came to court because she died from her wounds. Elam was condemned to be hanged. Definitions of domestic violence were also radically different in the later Middle Ages. Most acts of aggression that we would deem to be criminal were then thought of simply as acceptable discipline. If a wife disobeyed her husband, it was thought right and proper that she should be punished. Domestic violence does, though, sometimes appear in the records of ecclesiastical courts when a wife sued for divorce, or in criminal records when the violence resulted in permanent maiming, miscarriage, or death. How to distinguish between levels of acceptable domestic discipline and unacceptable domestic violence was an ongoing problem. One famous solution often cited was the rule of thumb, whereby it's claimed it was acceptable to beat your wife as long as the stick you used was thinner than your thumb. However, in reality, discussions were more sophisticated and less conclusive than this. In 1326 in Paris, one Colin Le Barbier hit his wife with a billiard stick so hard that she died. He was tried in a criminal court and found guilty of murder. However, he appealed and claimed that his wife deserved her suffering because she had nagged him so relentlessly in public. He said that he had not meant to kill her. He meant only to scare her so that she would be quiet. However, the stick accidentally entered into her thigh a little above the knee. The reason she had died, he added, was because she failed to tend the wound properly, rather than because he had mistreated her. His subsequent acquittal tells us a lot about attitudes in this period. Homicide, rape and domestic violence could be found across the social spectrum. However, some kinds of violence were more common in certain milieux. Violent theft was most often perpetrated by people on the economic margins of society who stole out of desperation. It peaked during periods of particular deprivation, such as the horrific famine of the 1310s, in which as much as 25% of the population died. England in the 14th and 15th centuries was also notorious for the prevalence of frightening gangs, often comprising gentry or even noblemen. These marauded around the countryside, plundering and leaving a trail of blood in their wake. In 1332, for example, the Fulville gang was accused of kidnapping a royal official. They had already killed a baron of the Exchequer. These were young men who quite literally thought themselves to be beyond the law, often involved in feuds and vendettas, and for whom honour was a key concept. A question of honour. Honour-driven violence was also prevalent at the top of the social tree. During periods of weak kingship, violence by noblemen could reach terrifying levels. In early 15th century France, with a king, Charles VI, the Mad, intermittently suffering from paranoid schizophrenia and believing himself to be made of glass, powerful warring nobles were able to seize control. The result was spiralling violence that culminated in the 1407 assassination of the Duke of Orleans, and ultimately the English entry into France. Things were not much rosier for the English. In the second half of the 15th century, the weakness of the reigning monarch, Henry VI, and the accumulation of huge retinues by hostile aristocrats were, at least in large part, responsible for the Wars of the Roses. The lines between interpersonal violence, civil war and full-blown war were indistinct. At the other end of the social spectrum, in the later Middle Ages, the growing structural inequalities created by rapid commercialization and urbanization, as well as competing forms of government, generated a series of riots and revolts. Plotted on a map, these are concentrated along the main trading belt of Europe, from London to Paris and the Netherlands, through the markets of Champagne to the commercial heartlands of northern Italy. The most famous examples, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, the Champy Revolt of 1378 in Florence, and the Paris Rebellion and Jacquerie Revolt in northern France in 1358, all involved complex alliances of rebels from various social groups demanding greater representation, railing against corruption, and protesting their economic marginalization. Revolts along social lines sometimes overlapped with violence driven by religion. Famously, medieval Europe was marked by waves of popular religious persecution, with anti-Semitism rearing its ugly head with depressing frequency. Yet perhaps the most violent dimension of medieval life was that of the law, which carried out its own gruesome rituals. Punishment was intended to be spectacular. Most serious crimes were punishable by hanging, but plenty more imaginative ways of disposing of criminals were employed. In many areas of Europe, those found guilty of forging money were boiled alive. This obsession with providing a spectacle of violence, to emphasize the guilt of the accused and to deter and awe observers, led to some almost farcical episodes. An old man questioned in the 1390s remembered how, when he was young, he saw a man hanged for murder. The body was cut down from the gibbet by a competing jurisdiction and rehanged, only for the original jurisdiction to construct a straw effigy that they hanged. Reactions to violence. We're left, then, with a picture of an extraordinarily violent society. Though it's very difficult to arrive at precise numbers, it's clear that this is not a society one would wish to visit for any length of time. There is, though, a flip side to all of this. The evidence suggests that, though violence was common, people were not simply inured to it. On the contrary, they really cared about it. This is not to say that violence was simply deemed to be wrong. Rather, it was a problem about which people worried and talked. The ethos of chivalry represents one way in which attempts were made to channel violence. Chivalric custom suggested that one should fight only with certain kinds of weapons, that one should seek only worthy opponents, and that one should exercise mercy and generosity. The reality was that chivalry underpinned some of the most brutal and bloodiest episodes in our history, notably the 100 Years' War. But the point remains that this was a set of customs arising out of concern and a sense that violence can be a problem. The most important clue that people worried about violence is the fact that they wrote about it. Medieval literature is full of descriptions of torture, but close readings of these texts show that torturers were demonized. Such a strategy would work only if people felt torture to be profoundly problematic, and they certainly did think it a problem. In 14th century France, criminal courts usually subjected the evidence gained from torture to extra scrutiny because it was deemed unreliable. Law and order was very harsh in medieval England. Those in charge of law and order believed that people would only learn how to behave properly if they feared what would happen to them if they broke the law. Even the smallest offences had serious punishments. The authorities feared the poor simply because there were many more poor than rich, and any revolt could be potentially damaging, as the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 proved. By the time of Henry II, the system of law in England had been improved because Henry sent out his own judges from London to listen to cases throughout all England's counties. Each accused person had to go through an ordeal. There were 3 ordeals. Ordeal by fire. An accused person held a red-hot iron bar and walked 3 paces. His hand was then bandaged and left for 3 days. If the wound was getting better after 3 days, you were innocent. If the wound had clearly not got any better, you were guilty. Ordeal by water. An accused person was tied up and thrown into water. If you floated, you were guilty of the crime you were accused of. Ordeal by combat. This was used by noblemen who had been accused of something. They would fight in combat with their accuser. Whoever won was right. Whoever lost was usually dead at the end of the fight. In 1215, the Pope decided that priests in England must not help with ordeals. As a result, ordeals were replaced by trials by juries. To start with, these were not popular with the people, as they felt that their neighbours might have a grudge against them and use the opportunity of a trial to get their revenge. After 1275, a law was introduced which allowed people to be tortured if they refused to go to trial before a jury. If you were found guilty of a crime, you would expect to face a severe punishment. Thieves had their hands cut off. Women who committed murder were strangled and then burnt. People who illegally hunted in royal parks had their ears cut off, and high treason was punishable by being hung, drawn and quartered. There were very few prisons as they cost money, and local communities were not prepared to pay for their upkeep. It was cheaper to execute someone for bad crimes or mutilate them and then let them go. Most towns had a gibbet just outside of it. People were hung on these and their bodies left to rot over the weeks as a warning to others. However, such violent punishments clearly did not put off people. In 1202, the city of Lincoln in England had 114 murders, 89 violent robberies, and 65 people were wounded in fights. Only 2 people were executed for these crimes, and it can be concluded that many in Lincoln got away with their crime. How do you deal with a thief? You cut off one of his hands. Drug dealers should be hanged. Women who have committed adultery should be stoned to death. Although such punishments are inconceivable in the Netherlands, this is the harsh reality abroad. The instruments of correction in the prison gate show that here too punishments used to be humiliating and gruesome. Convictions were followed by horrific scenes. For 400 years the prison gate served as the prison of the Court of Holland, not as a prison for convicted offenders, but as a house of detention. The accused would await their sentences here, sentences that could result in fines, banishment, or horrific scenes. There were roughly 3 kinds of punishments: public humiliation, corporal punishment, and the death penalty. Public humiliation, being made to look a fool in front of everyone. Public humiliation was intended as a deterrent and to establish the state's monopoly on violence. Nowadays, a suspect will be the focus of media attention, until they are sentenced. Once the suspect has been sent to prison, the media coverage falls silent. For centuries, though, the opposite was true. The condemned was then punished in front of the largest possible audience. This was because humiliation formed an important part of the punishment, certainly for punishments such as the stocks or pillory. If convicted, you would be put in the stocks or tied to the pillory, or you would have to walk through the market dragging a stone of shame. Members of the public were allowed to shout insults and pelt you with rotten fruit, sometimes even with excrement. The crime that you had committed was announced on a placard known as a placard of shame. Corporal punishment, from temporary pain to permanent mutilation. Corporal punishment went a step further. These forms of punishment caused temporary pain and discomfort, such as beatings and whippings. There were also punishments that led to permanent mutilation, such as branding, chopping off limbs, or mutilating someone's tongue, nose, eyes, or ears. With a split nose or the brand of the city on your forehead, not only had you endured a painful experience, but everyone could see for the rest of your life that you had committed a crime. The medievals consumed alcohol all the time at every event, whether that was a wedding, a funeral, a business negotiation, or the completion of an apprenticeship. They really didn't need an excuse. They even drank at work all day, every day. Which begs the question, were the people who lived through the Middle Ages always drunk? It makes you wonder how they could work, fight their many wars, or even function properly when they were all constantly hammered. By the 14th century, brewing was a common occupation in towns and cities across England. Ale was sold out of houses and on the streets. On market day, alcohol could be bought at stalls in the marketplace, and there was even more brewing and drinking at fair time. The buying and consumption of alcohol was seen as a necessity rather than a luxury. Red wine for the wealthier people. There were inns. They first appeared in the 12th and 13th centuries, usually located in towns, and had plenty of staff to look after their rich patrons. Inside the inn, bids known as tapsters and chamberlains would see to the client's every need. Even the oser or groom was there to look after the guest's horse. In 1578, the York magistrates insisted that all innkeepers had to have at least 6, quote, comely and decent honest beds for guests. These people had money and came from the merchant or professional classes. In 1390, a man named John P.R. was in London on business from Oxford University. He stayed at an inn in St Benet's parish. His room was burgled while he was out, and the grand sum of 200 shillings was stolen in coins and bonds, a huge amount at the time, and the equivalent of over £65,000 today, which only goes to show the calibre of the customers using these sort of establishments. Business negotiations often took place in the inn. Technically, trading was supposed to be done exclusively in the marketplace, where it could be taxed and regulated. However, this didn't stop many from exchanging contracts in the inns and having a celebratory drink afterwards. Most ordinary people couldn't afford to pay for the wine or the lavish meals that were sold in the inn. Tavern came somewhere between the inn and the lowly alehouse. Here, those with a little more money in their pockets could purchase a cup of wine. Taverns were essentially drinking houses for the rich and lovers of good wine. As one pilgrim neatly put it, one tavern on Patoso in London had 2 floors with 30 seats on each story. The Galley on Lombard Street had, quote, 8 tables, seats and trestles, pots and barrels of Rhenish, Gascon and MSY wine. In 1330, to try and slow the culture of drinking, King Edward II ruled that no wine under the price of 3p a gallon should be sold because, quote, there be more taverns in the realm than there won to be. Drinks after work. Alehouses, on the other hand, were for the ordinary people. Dank, dark and smelling of stale ale, with rushes thrown across the floor, they were rowdy places full of laughter, tall tales and bawdy songs. They existed simply for the entertainment of the masses and were full to the brim with everyone and anyone, from carters and carpenters to gong farmers and from sailors to strumpets. For the commoners, there were alcoholic alternatives to beer. Rough cider was produced in large quantities in the west and south of England in the late Middle Ages. At the manor of Alistan in Sussex, over 500 gallons of cider were made every year. Day labourers were often paid in food and drink for their toil. Providing strong ale was seen as a way of keeping employees motivated and well-nourished. The better the ale, the higher the calories, and landowners would often fight over workers by offering the strongest ale. It's not known how the workers were able to remain productive, though, when they were loaded with high-strength beer. It's thought that ale may have constituted up to half of the daily calorific intake of an English peasant. In 1289, carters at Battle Abbey Manor and Faring were given rye bread, cheese and ale in the morning, fish, meat and more drink at midday, and more ale in the evening before going home. 100 years later in Nottingham, some mowers were given pottage, bread, beef, pork, lamb, veal, and ale to mow the Lord's meadow. They were allowed to enter the manor another 3 times for a refill of more drink. Then they were given a bucket of ale to take home at the end of their shift, beer money. Communal activities were always a good excuse for heavy drinking, and on those occasions it was even encouraged. Religious and seasonal festivals like Whitsun, Michaelmas, and Yuletide saw the charitable concept of church ale, in some areas called Scot or Leal. The idea was that people would donate beer or the ingredients to brew a batch of ale, and then buy it back by the cupful. It was a way of raising funds, sometimes as charitable donations to the poor. In Wiltshire, during the 13th century at the Devils, the Scot ale went on for 3 days. On the last day, any bachelors in the village were encouraged to drink any ale that was left, for free, as long as they could stand up. Communal drinking often took place in the churchyard, and the church authorities regarded the drunken affairs as ungodly, as they often led to disorder. There were attempts to ban the church ale, and although the clergy were forbidden from taking part, this order was often ignored, and the event was held away from the holy building instead, with the clerics joining in. Archbishop Langham went so far as demanding the excommunication of anyone taking part in, quote, these common drinking bounce patches, matches and dispatches. Drinking was a part of medieval life from birth. Neighbouring women who helped with the birthing would bring drink with them as they assisted in the labour. This was for nourishment and to fortify them during the ordeal. A special drink was brewed, known as Mother's Coddle, which consisted of warm ale with added wine, sugar and spices. It was meant to sustain the woman's strength during childbirth. It was seen as an essential part of the process for mothers to have booze, even when they were in labour, and to help in their healing process after. Once a child was born, the parents were expected to provide drinks for the guests at the christening. Just as it is today, drinking was an accepted part of marriage celebrations. Bride's ale was a tradition practiced by most families and involved either the bride or her mother bringing a batch of ale for friends and neighbours to enjoy. The catch was, they had to pay a ridiculous amount for the tipple. The profits went to the happy couple as a wedding gift. The tradition became so popular in England that the words bride's ale merged to form the word bridal. But the church was not happy, and 100 years after Bishop Langham had called for the banning of Scot Alice, bride ales were prohibited in the parishes of Canterbury. Many couples exchanged their vows or marriage contracts. Where else but in the tavern? This could cause problems, though, as one woman discovered when she was dragged before the ecclesiastical courts. Apparently she had contracted a marriage with a man who had proposed to her in the tavern one night as they were drinking. The woman argued that just because she chose to accompany a man for drinks didn't mean that she was now contracted to marry him. On the death of a wealthy person, large quantities of alcohol were consumed at the wake. In 1319, at the funeral of the Bishop of Winchester in Souk, London, 1,100 gallons of ale were consumed. People would often leave instructions in their will that drink had to be given to the poor, on the expectation that they would then pray for the soul of the departed. When the will of Stephen Thomas of Lee in Essex was read out in 1417, it had stipulated that, quote, 10 bushels of malt should be brewed after his death so that every poor man might have a gallon of ale. Some wills also made provision of alcohol for their loved ones. For example, a widow might be provided with a certain quantity of wine for the rest of her life. Have another. In the aftermath of the Black Death, living standards rose, along with wages, as the demand for land declined. There were too many jobs available and not enough people to fill the vacancies. Many abandoned their villages and migrated to the towns and cities. By the beginning of the 15th century, a craftsman in the south of England was able to buy 4 gallons of good ale with a day's wages, That's 3 times the amount he would have been able to purchase 100 years previously. The poorer villagers and townspeople, who probably drank buttermilk or water from wells and springs because they could not find the money for beer, were now able to afford it. And more people than ever were drinking alcohol. This caused Sir John Forkew to now remark that the English peasantry drank no water unless it be for devotion, the demon drink. Just as it does today, too much alcohol could lead to accidents, trouble, aggression, fights, and even murders. Many towns imposed a curfew on their citizens to prevent people from falling into rivers and getting into brawls. Making it home was no guarantee of safety either when someone was badly intoxicated, like one man from Oxford named John AOL, who was very drunk and died after dinner, sitting to eat with a knife in his hand, when he not only fell asleep but also fell on the knife and was wounded around the navel. Henry Doodley also died by falling on his knife when he was drunk and stumbled in his bedchamber. And there's a couple who appeared in the Oxford coroner's rolls, quote, "In the 25th year of King Edward, Adam G. and Marjorie, his wife, had been at a tavern and were drunk beyond measure, went to bed, left the candle burning, and fell asleep. Marjorie was burned even to the belly and died the next day. Adam could not save her and scarce escaped, his hands and feet burnt to the bones. Or William, who was standing at the top of his London tenement stairs, drunk and naked one August night in 1336. Sadly, William, who was relieving himself, misjudged his footing and fell to the floor, where he perished. There is always the possibility that violence will occur when people consume too much alcohol, which is what happened to Arnold and John, who by all accounts were friends, or at least friendly. They sat together, consuming a tipple in a tavern known as the Moses in 1420. It wasn't long before resentment flared, and because of the alcohol, Arnold was more than a little rude about John's concubine. Affronted, John drew his dagger and attacked his companion, pinning him to the floor of the tavern. Then Arnold drew his knife and stabbed his friend, killing him. For the medievals, drink and drunkenness were a socially accepted part of life. After all, it wasn't called merry old England for nothing. Beer is one of humanity's oldest tipples, known in Mesopotamia and Egypt as early as 6000 BCE. Beer brewing probably arrived in Neolithic Europe by 5000 BCE, and was brewed from barley on other grains on a pretty small domestic scale. Although wine was the more popular drink in much of the Roman Empire, Roman soldiers on Hadrian's Wall sustained themselves with cerveza, Celtic beer, which may have been known as curum to the Britons. The Anglo-Saxons introduced the word ale into the English language, and even used the word alu as a sort of magical healing word. Clearly they were big believers in the power of a pint. Generally speaking, medieval brewing happened in 3 phases. The first was malting, involving the treatment of the brewing grain by converting the starch to sugar water. They were drenched in warm water, which released a chemical enzyme to let this process be carried out. The malted and unmalted grains would then be taken for the second phase, mashing. Water was added, and all the grains mushed together while the enzyme made it into a sugary mix, known as wort. Finally, the liquid wort would be separated from the grain solids and placed in an urn for the fermentation phase. It would be left to either ferment on its own or have yeast added to help it along. Any remaining solid grains would likely be taken to be malted or mushed again with another batch to ensure none of it was wasted. L.F. Saltzman goes into more detail on the subject of English brewing. Their main product was ale, described by a contemporary of the 16th century as the Englishman's natural drink. In the 12th century it was described as the people's food in liquid form. Some people brewed it in their own homes and could sell it to locals. To show they were open for business, they would take a broom and stick it above the door to their home, indicating theirs was an alehouse. However, all ale had to be verified by an official taster before it could be sold. While this seems like it would be an enviable position, you have to remember they would be required to sample all of the drink. To give an idea of how much that would involve, Coventry in 1520 had 60 brewers for a population of 6,600. If it was good, then fantastic. If not, well, you'd certainly be the first to know. However, there were measures for the selling of bad drink. In Coventry, a man who made bad wine was forced to drink it, and then had it emptied all over him. Hops were a part of the process that weren't introduced until much later, particularly where the English were concerned. According to Fiafelli, their earliest recorded use was in the 8th century. Initially, it was a practice that started in Germany, stemming from various hop gardens referenced there, and later spread throughout the rest of Europe. Not only did it alter the flavour to a more bitter taste compared to the sweeter tasting ale, but it also increased its longevity, meaning it could be stored and kept, as well as transported and traded. Before that, beer and ale had to be brewed and sold locally, due to its much smaller lifespan before it went flat and started to go off. It became a major part of trading for most northern European towns, and found its way overseas at the end of the 14th century to Britain. The English took a rather nationalistic stance on their drink. They were reluctant to adopt hops into their brewing practices, and beer was regarded as something to be kept to foreigners. One contemporary dismissed it since it doth make a man fat and doth inflate the belly, citing the physique of the Dutch as an example of this. In 1531, the royal brewer was forbidden from using hops in their brewing. Even so, an Act of Parliament permitted foreigners to continue their trade in England, mainly because most native-born English folk didn't want to drink their beer anyway, and they still had a market from overseas travellers. However, as the 14th century went on, hops brewing became more popular when the longevity of hop-brewed beer became apparent and more money was being made. This was especially true in places like Sussex, where large numbers of hops began to be imported. Eventually, in 1577, a contemporary spoke of the old ale as thick and foulsome, cementing that beer had supplanted it, but Gieterkamp details more about brewing in medieval England and beyond. It may come as surprising to learn that one of the main sources of beer brewing in England was monasteries. They were the closest to brewing ale on what could be considered a commercial scale, brewing it for their brothers and for pilgrims. The monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland has surviving architectural plans which reveal the scale of one such operation. A malt house, a kiln, mill room, 3 breweries and storage cellars brewing 3 different kinds of beer. One for monks, one for lay brothers, and one for pilgrims. The monks themselves drank their own product a lot since ale was a liquid. Therefore, like water, it wasn't considered breaking their fast like food was. It was used as a dietary supplement, along with being drunken for spiritual and medicinal purposes, regarded as a ubiquitous social lubricant. Venerable Bede even makes note of how monks were given to excessive drinking, and how they cast off Christ by giving themselves over to drunkenness. In addition, the English clergy had a reputation in Europe for behaving in a manner very similar to football hooligans. Many monasteries actually became famous for the brews they made, and would be given a good income from those who came to sample them. As beer brewing became more commercialised, this influence declined. A big reason was because local ruling authorities favoured these commercial breweries over monasteries for taxation purposes, and it helped make up the windfall from lost taxes by the monastic groups. Tax was part of the reason why hops took a little while to take off. Before hops were introduced, all beer and ale had to be brewed with a substance called gruit, and it was forbidden to brew without it. The local ruler would tax the brewer on the amount of gruit they used in their brewing, which was used to flavour the drink. Hops brewing was prohibited for a long time, partially because these rulers didn't want to lose this valuable income. As hops became more popular, lords and ladies were able to start levying taxes for commercial brewers, since it was in their best interest to have a steady supply of alcohol, as it was integral to the social order. By about 1600, beer brewing was one of the leading trades in towns and cities. As always seems to be the case, London represented the main bulk of the trade, though traditional brewing could be found in small local settlements. So, that's a little bit of our coverage on the considered highlights of brewing in the medieval period. While drinking in the pub is an activity that has certainly been disrupted by recent events, it can definitely be said that the making and drinking of alcohol is a long-established human practice that will continue for many years to come. Cheers. Edward II was one of the kings most intimately acquainted with Newcastle Castle, spending a lot of time here during his reign, whether he was fighting against the Scots or his own barons. He must also be one of the most frequently discussed and least understood of all medieval kings. Perhaps this has something to do with the failures of his reign. After all, successful kings tend to get a bland heroic portrayal, or at the very least a suitably potent villainous role. Richard the Lionheart is generally remembered as the good guy in Robin Hood stories and not much more, while Edward I, Edward II's father, is usually remembered through the lens of his Welsh and Scottish wars as the tyrant Longshanks who conquered Wales and tried unsuccessfully to do the same to Scotland. Historians may take a more nuanced view of these kings. Richard the Lionheart often comes in for some criticism for spending relatively little time in England during his reign, preferring to do battle for his lands in France or for the Church on crusade in the Holy Land. Edward I may have been a belligerent warrior, but he was also a strong reformer who did his best to root out corruption in the government and legal system of England. But where you get someone who is regarded as a bad king, such as John, Edward II or Richard II, people can project all sorts of their own obsessions and neuroses onto them to explain their downfalls, and they often come across to modern readers as more compelling characters for this reason. With Edward II, this projection has tended to take the form of overt homophobia, with most history books concluding that Edward's fondness for his chosen favourites — there are plenty of not-so-subtle euphemisms at play — over the established nobility of England was the cause of his failure as a king, his downfall and eventual death. In modern pop culture, this is perhaps best illustrated by Edward's portrayal in the influential 1995 film Braveheart. Edward II has only a tiny part in this film, with the role of villain taken up by the scenery chewing Patrick McGoohan as his father, Edward I. Prince Edward is portrayed as a camp stereotype of a gay man, uninterested in his beautiful French wife in favour of a handsome knight the film calls Philip. In a pretty grisly scene, Edward I kills Philip by throwing him out of a window, which is largely played for a cheap laugh. Edward was not yet married at the time the film is set, and Isabella, who would become his wife, was only 9. Philip is presumably supposed to be based on the handsome Gascon knight Sir Piers Gaveston, who is the man most frequently named as Edward's lover. In real life, Edward was described by his contemporaries as tall and strong, a fine figure of a handsome man. His effigy in Gloucester Cathedral shows him as a handsome man with long hair and curling beard. Although some later historians called him a coward due to his lack of success in battle, the sources don't bear this out either. In his most famous battle, Bannockburn, he may have proven a disastrous commander who lost the battle, but he fought on the front line armed with a mace, and only left the field when his bodyguard physically dragged him away for his own safety. Whatever his sexuality was, it does him a massive disservice to portray him as a stereotype. While the incredibly camp characterisation of Edward in Braveheart is based purely on homophobic stereotypes, the idea that Edward II was England's first gay king goes much farther back. In fact, while he was still on the throne, insinuations about the king's infatuation with his close advisors were common. Even the famous story of his death seems to have come about as a sort of nasty comment on what the authors thought of his sexual orientation. The story goes that when Edward was eventually forced to abdicate and then murdered by his wife and her ally Roger Mortimer, he was killed by having a red-hot poker inserted into him, a not very veiled reference to what medieval authors would have called the sin of sodomy. The fact that this story is not true but was invented sometime after the king's presumed death has not stopped it from being one of the best-known stories about Edward down to the modern day. It is a story repeated by Christopher Marlowe, a contemporary of William Shakespeare, in his play The Troublesome Reign and Lamentable Death of Edward II, King of England, with the tragical fall of proud Mortimer, better known for obvious reasons as Edward Thursu. This play, written in the 1590s, makes Edward's homosexuality the main theme of the play, and has led many people to theorise that Marlowe himself was gay, and exploring his sexuality through this play. In 1991, Derek Jarman adapted the play into a film and included overt references to the gay rights movement and the Stonewall riots, arguably making Edward II one of the earliest of England's gay icons. Of course, we often hear that it is fraught with difficulty to read modern sexual identities back into the past. To an extent, this is true. Edward would not have recognised terms like homosexual or identified himself in that way. People in the Middle Ages were defined by their status, their family, their religion, their place of origin and other factors than sexuality, a concept that did not exist at all. At the same time, nothing has fundamentally changed about human beings between Edward's time and our own. Medieval people felt desire, love and other emotions in the same way that we do. They just had different ways of describing their experiences. We also know that the idea that LGBTQ+ people simply did not exist in the medieval period because the words did not exist is, not to put too fine a point on it, total rubbish. Medieval society was obsessed with, and had a complicated relationship with, sex. Their ideas may have differed from our own, but this hardly means that people in the modern day can't look back and see their own experiences mirrored in those of the people of the past. We do, for example, have records of at least one transgender woman living in 14th century London, and references to homosexual behaviour are surprisingly common. Such relationships were not yet technically illegal in England. Sex between men was outlawed in secular law under Henry VIII and remained so until the 1960s, although they were regarded by the church as sinful. What wasn't? To the medieval church, the only form of acceptable sex was between a man and his wife, solely for the purposes of producing a child. Even enjoying sex with your spouse was considered sinful. Other sexual sins, including fornication, having sex while unmarried, and sodomy. Sodomy was any sexual act which gave pleasure, but which could not lead to pregnancy. The fact is, a huge number of people of all sexual orientations would have fallen foul of church rules against sodomy, which also included any kind of homosexuality. In fact, even allowing for the overactive imaginations of many churchmen, it does rather seem from the surviving records that what the church called sodomy was going on all over the place much of the time, even in other parts of Europe where the law treated such relationships more harshly. Many of the chroniclers who wrote about Edward and Piers Gaveston's relationship presumed that it was a sexual one. The Westminster Chronicle says that his love for Piers Gaveston led him to reject the embraces of his wife, while another medieval chronicle puts it a bit more bluntly and says that the king rejoiced in sodomy. French observers at his coronation said that he seemed more attracted to Gaveston than his wife. His wife was only 12 years old at the time, so that is probably for the best. We know that Edward referred to Piers Gaveston as his brother, and spoke often of his love for him. At the same time, Edward fathered 4 legitimate children with his wife, and at least 1 illegitimate son, and Piers Gaveston also fathered several illegitimate children. In light of medieval views of sexuality, this is not particularly surprising. Perhaps in the modern day, both men might have identified as bisexual. In the end, though, it's difficult to disentangle the real relationship between Edward II and Piers Gaveston, and indeed, later between the king and Hugh Despencer, another royal favourite, from the accusations and judgment of their peers and later historians. To many people, the idea of a loving relationship between the king and another man was inherently dangerous and destabilising to the state, and the fact that both of Edward's favourites were executed by his enemies before the king himself was finally overthrown by his own wife has certainly influenced the way that Edward's relationships have been viewed by posterity. What is interesting is that this aspect of Edward's life has been speculated on so often over the centuries since his death, with each generation relating Edward's life to their own experience, all the way from the medieval chroniclers to Christopher Marlowe to Sir George Benjamin, who premiered his opera lessons in Love and Violence at the Royal Opera's House in 2018. Each generation relates Edward's life and relationships to their own experiences and will continue to do so. You're born into 17th century England, into what people might call a decent family, not rich enough for fancy silk, not poor enough to starve, just comfortably forgettable. Your mother does all the cooking, cleaning and, well, keeping you alive. Your father, he's never home for long, always out doing stuff. Then you hit the 1-year mark. Huge achievement, by the way. You've officially dodged the Grim Reaper newborn sweep, where nearly 40% of kids like you don't make it this far. Congrats. By age 3, you start realising something's weird. Nobody visits your home, you don't live near other kids, and for some reason your mother never lets you wander outside. Something about wolves, stray ones that apparently enjoy snacking on children. Then, one evening, your world cracks open just a little. Mum takes you to the market for vegetables, and instead of the grand adventure you imagined, you get stared at. Hard. People whisper, some glare, a few even curse at you and your mother. You're 3 years old, so obviously you have no idea what's happening. Maybe you dropped food on your shirt, maybe they just hate toddlers. Then you hear it. Executioner's brat. Your mother doesn't wait for more. She grabs you and hauls you home, moving faster than you've ever seen her. But it's too late. The word is out, and now so is your curiosity. That night, you wait. You sit, fidgeting, until Papa finally walks through the door, flamboyant coat looking like he just stepped off a stage. You don't even let him sit down. You need answers. And so, with a sigh, your father leans in and tells you why you live in the shadows, why people spit when they see your family. Your father is an executioner. And suddenly, the wolves don't seem so scary anymore. Your father is the man they call when they want someone dead, the walking embodiment of justice, or at least that's what the city tells itself. But there's a tiny little problem. He's getting old. And guess what? You're next in line. Wait, what? No. You had plans. Good plans. Maybe a blacksmith shaping steel instead of splitting skulls. Maybe a knight gutting enemies on the battlefield, not butchering criminals in the city square. Anything but this. Your father doesn't sugarcoat it. He sits you down, looks you straight in the eye, and hits you with the harsh truth. Nobody in the city will let you do anything else. Your father once dreamed of being a knight too, but that was never going to happen. His father was an executioner. His father before him was an executioner, and his father's father, guess what? Executioner. This is the family business. You're trapped. At age 12, training begins. Like any other job, you need to learn the trade. You start small, taking care of execution tools, sharpening axes, swords and ropes, cleaning up the execution sites after someone loses their head. It's gruesome, sure, but bearable, because at least you haven't had to watch someone die. Oh, look at that. You jinxed it. 8 months in, your father calls you to witness your first real execution. A man stands on the scaffold, weeping, begging for mercy. His children are in the crowd, screaming for their father's life. The crowd watches, some solemn, some hungry for blood. Your father stands there not like a man, but like a reaper waiting for the job to be done. And then, the rope. Snap. His neck. It hits you. This isn't just training. This is your life. Bitter, angry, trapped. You clean up the blood, haul the body away while the city glares at your father like he was the one who made the sentencing, like he's the villain. And one day, that'll be you. You're 14 now. 2 years of scrubbing bloodstains and hauling corpses have earned you the right to start real training. And by training, you mean something that makes those past 2 years feel like a vacation in Disneyland, if Disneyland had a chopping block and torture chambers. First lesson? Human anatomy. No, not sketches or dusty books. You learn by watching your father slice open real corpses right in front of you. At first, you turn away, gagging, but you don't get to look away for long. You learn, or you bleed. That's the rule. Every mistake is corrected with a beating. Executioners don't just kill, they extract information, which means you also learn the art of torture, and learning means watching. You watch him tear out a man's teeth one by one, while the victim screams and writhes in agony. You don't like it, but over time you learn something useful. Pulling out teeth with your bare hands, sloppy. A pair of pliers, much cleaner. A year passes. You master how to keep a man alive just long enough to make him confess. How the body works, where to cut deep, where to cut slow. You're almost ready to start killing. Except no. This job isn't just swinging a sword for money. There are rules. 2 more years, 2 years of memorizing laws, city regulations, execution protocols. Just you and your father, in a profession so cursed that nobody ever applies for the job. You don't have to compete. You don't have to prove yourself against anyone, because no one wants to live the life you were born into. Then finally your father decides it's time, but not for public executions. Not yet. First, you practice by torturing prisoners for confessions. It's slow, messy work, but you do it. And when your father sees that you can break a man without flinching, he nods. Now you're ready. Your first public execution. You pull on the black cloak, not to hide your identity, everyone knows who you are. It's to strike fear into their hearts. The crowd watches in silence as you step onto the scaffold, sword in hand. You keep your back straight, grip firm, unyielding. But inside, you're sweating, shaking, your heart hammering against your ribs. Your father's words echo in your head. Fake it till you make it. The convicted man is dragged onto the podium. He's forced to his knees. The priest murmurs a final blessing. You don't wait. Your sword flashes. One clean stroke. His head flies. The crowd gasps. The execution was so fast, so smooth, that for a second they can't believe it actually happened. You're good. Disturbingly good. The crowd disperses, but not without giving you a storm of curses. Even the priests spit at your feet like you chose this life, like you wanted to be a butcher in a cloak. Execution after execution, you improve. You refine your technique. Your father notices. Even he can't deny your talent. Soon, he retires. The title is yours now. The city's official executioner. Time to enjoy everything your father did. Being an executioner isn't just about swinging a blade and spilling blood. It comes with privileges. You're paid well, not just for killing, but for keeping the market streets sane. You're also allowed to take whatever you want from the dead: clothes, jewellery, boots. Your wardrobe is built on corpses, and this makes people hate you even more. Imagine this. Elizabeth, whose father you beheaded yesterday, sees you parading through the market in his favourite coat. How do you think she feels? That's right. She wants to kill you, but she won't, because you're untouchable. The church refuses to let you in unless it's a special mass. That's rare. They say you're unclean, an unnecessary evil. And yet, you're expected to marry. So you leave your father's home, buy a house on the city outskirts, and find someone as hated as you, a whore. She's beautiful. She understands you. She has no family, no one to judge her for choosing the city's butcher. Your wedding is as empty as your childhood dreams. No priests, no guests, just you, your parents, and one aunt, who probably came for the free meal. But at least you're happy. And for an executioner, happiness is a rarity. 1,000 deaths later, the years roll by. You become famous. Your name reaches neighbouring cities. 1,000 executions under your belt, and you are now a legend of death, feared more than any of your ancestors. But this isn't a statistic you take pride in. It haunts you every night. Their faces flood your dreams. Their screams crawl inside your ears and refuse to leave. The weight of their deaths crushes your chest. But life has one mercy left to give you. Your wife gives birth to a son and a daughter. For the first time you know true joy. You love them fiercely, protecting them, giving them a good life. That's all that matters now. But something is wrong. You feel it in your bones, your muscles. The stance that once made you a pillar of fear is now hard to hold. Your hands shake. It's only a matter of time before you make a mistake, and in this job, a mistake is death. The cycle continues. There's only one choice left. You hate it, but you know what must be done. You take your son aside and begin to train him, just as your father trained you. You carve the same fate into him as was carved into you. He hates it just like you did, but this is the only way. If he is to survive, he must be better than you. because in this life you don't live by mercy, you live by the blade. One afternoon in May 1573, a 19-year-old man named Franz Schmidt stood in the backyard of his father's house in the German state of Bavaria, preparing to behead a stray dog with a sword. He'd recently graduated from decapitating inanimate pumpkins to practicing on live animals. If he passed this final stage, Schmidt would be considered ready to start his job as an executioner of people. We know the details of this morbid scene because Schmidt meticulously chronicled his life as an executioner, writing a series of diaries that painted a rich picture of this profession during the 16th century. His words provided a rare glimpse of the humanity behind the violence, revealing a man who took his work seriously and often felt empathy for his victims. But what's more, Schmidt wasn't necessarily all that unusual. Historical anecdotes reveal that the prevailing stereotype of the hooded, blood-spattered, brutish executioner falls far short of the truth. So then, what was it like to do this work hundreds of years ago in Europe? And how did executioner become a legitimate job title in the first place? What's common to all countries in Europe at the time is that they're all trying to have better criminal law enforcement, said Joel Harrington, a historian at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee, and the author of The Faithful Executioner, Life and Death, Honour and Shame in the Turbulent 16th Century. Picador, 2013, a book about Schmidt's life. The problem was that things were a little like the American Wild West, in that most criminals got away, Harrington told Live Science. So when they did catch them, they really liked to make a good example and have a public spectacle. Hence the need for public executioners to carry out that work. But people weren't exactly lining up for the job of hanging, beheading or burning criminals at the stake. Most people understandably saw this as undesirable work. In fact, those who ultimately became executioners didn't choose the job for themselves. Instead, it was bestowed upon them. In some cases, butchers were roped in to become executioners, or convicts were offered the job as an alternative to their own deaths. But typically, executioners came into the jobs through family ties. Most in the profession were men whose fathers had been executioners before them, Harrington explained. Even the diarist Schmidt was descended from an executioner. His father had unwillingly received the job when randomly ordained by a prince as a royal executioner. Over time, this passing of the baton from father to son created what Harrington called long-standing execution dynasties that spread across Europe during the Middle Ages. But the existence of those dynasties also reveals the poor image executioners had at the time. People were trapped in this family cycle of employment because in reality, they had few other opportunities to work, according to Harrington. People whose professions revolved around death were people that the rest of society did not want to associate with. So executioners were typically consigned to the fringes of society, and even forced to literally live at the edge of town. People wouldn't have invited executioners into their homes. Many executioners were not allowed to go into churches. Marriage has to be done at the executioner's home, Harrington said. Some schools would not even take the children of executioners. This social isolation meant that executioners were left to consort with others, forced to occupy society's underworld, undesirables such as prostitutes, lepers, and criminals. That only boosted public suspicion of executioners and their families. Executioners, therefore, were a conundrum, crucial for maintaining law and order, yet shunned because of their unsavoury work. Attitudes toward professional executioners were highly ambiguous. They were considered both necessary and impure at the same time, said Hannele Clemetilla McHale, an adjunct professor of cultural history at the University of Turku in Finland, who has studied representations of executioners. Yet, there were some professional perks to this morbid work. Executioners benefited from something called havage, a kind of tax that gave them the right to take a portion of food and drink from market vendors for free, said Clemetilla McHale. What's more, the authorities usually gave the executioner free lodging and released him from tolls and taxes, she told Live Science. These small allowances were intended to compensate for executioners' social isolation, and to compel them to stay in the job, but at odds with their lowly societal position, was the professionalism that executioners were expected to show in their work. While the business of execution may seem like it would require little more than brute strength and barbarity, in reality, executioners needed a relatively high degree of expertise to do the job smoothly, said Clemetilla McHale. The office holder was expected to be successful at every execution. If he failed, he was accused not only of incompetence but also of cruelty, she said. In some regions, executioners were limited to 3 strokes for a beheading, and if a grisly scene resulted from one too many swings of the axe or sword, there could be serious consequences. Sometimes, an unsuccessful executioner was attacked by the furious spectators, and if he survived, the authorities punished him by withholding his fee or with imprisonment or dismissal, Clemetilla McHale explained. There was clearly a powerful incentive to execute as cleanly as possible, and that meant having a relatively good understanding of the human body. Contrary to popular opinion, executioners weren't uneducated. In fact, those in the profession had uncommonly high literacy rates for members of their social class, along with fundamental knowledge of human anatomy, Harrington said. This led to a surprising irony of the job. Some executioners could double up as doctors. This created an interesting societal paradox. People who didn't want anything to do with an executioner socially would come to his house and ask to be healed, Harrington said. We know, for instance, that Schmidt had many more patients he healed than people he executed, Harrington added. In fact, Schmidt wrote that doctoring would have been his chosen career had he not been forced into execution. Clearly, executioners from olden times were more than just blood-spattered brutes. Instead, the history books paint a picture of regular people forced into a job that nobody else would do, and in a time when execution was deemed essential for keeping the peace. Forget that image of the hood and them being anonymous and sadistic, Harrington said. They would have seen themselves as law enforcement officials. There's a final twist in the story of Schmidt. Over the course of his career, he had gained an unusual degree of respect due to his notable professionalism, which led to his appointment as the official executioner of the town of Bamberg, Bavaria. That earned Schmidt a generous salary and allowed him to live a very comfortable life with his family in a large home. However, he was still stigmatized because of his work, a fate he did not want to pass on to his children. So as a retired 70-year-old, Schmidt made it his mission to restore his family name. He appealed to Bavaria's authorities to release the Schmidt sons from their father's tormented legacy, and his bold bid was a success. His children were ultimately freed from a life at the executioner's block and given the right to pursue their own careers, as Schmidt had always wished to do. A happy ending to the executioner's tale. During the Middle Ages, common people lived incredibly harsh and physically demanding lives. They were serfs at the very bottom of the feudal system and had to swear an oath on the Bible to serve and obey their local lord. Many peasants worked as farmers for the lords who owned the fields, and because of the nature of farming, certain tasks had to be done at very specific times of the year. Not only did they have to work their own small patches of land, but they were also obliged to work for free on church land. This was a huge inconvenience, time they could have spent providing food and money for their own families. The church held so much power that people were terrified of committing any sin that might offend God and cost them their place in heaven. On top of that, peasants had to pay a tithe, 1/10 of whatever they earned, to the church, either in money or goods. Since money was scarce, peasants usually paid in seeds, causing great hardship. They were left short of what they needed to sow the fields the following year. The church kept these tithes in massive barns. Sadly, much of the grain stored there would be ruined by rats, their urine, and their droppings. In 1395, the French historian and poet Jean Froissart described how much power the nobility had over the serfs. He wrote that serfs were bound by law to plough the fields of their masters, harvest the corn, gather it into barns and thrash the grain. They must mow and carry home the hay, cut and collect wood, and perform all manner of tasks of this kind. The forests were generally owned by nobles or even the king himself, Anyone caught poaching game faced severe punishment, while many peasants raised animals like chickens, sheep and cows to provide eggs, wool and dairy. The meat was a rare luxury. Eggs were so valuable that chickens were rarely killed for food. Animals like cattle and sheep couldn't survive through the winter without human help, so they would be slaughtered at the start of the cold season. Joints of meat were preserved by salting or smoking, hanging on hooks above the hearth to feed the family until spring. Peasants typically lived in wooden framed crook houses with barely any furniture. Straw lined the dirt floors. Cooking, sleeping and living all happened in a single room. At night, animals were brought inside to protect them from wild bears and wolves, still common in medieval England, and from thieves. Of course, bringing animals indoors made conditions even filthier. The livestock weren't house-trained and often carried fleas and mites. Beds were nothing more than straw-filled mattresses that attracted vermin. Peasants themselves were often infested with lice. There was no running water, no toilets. Human waste was collected in a bucket and either tossed into the street or dumped in nearby rivers or ponds, the same ones they used for washing and cooking. Lovely. The most commonly eaten meat among peasants was beef, ironically considered too vulgar for the nobility. A family might keep a cow until it was too old to milk, then slaughter it for meat. Nothing was wasted. The hide became leather. Bones were turned into needles, tools, or even weapons. Pigs were particularly valuable. They needed little care, could forage for food in forests and even cities, and could defend themselves against predators. When slaughtered, every part of the pig was used. Blood was made into black puddings, intestines became sausage casings, and even trotters were used for making jelly. Bacon and ham, once cured, became essential wintertime staples. In cities, few had their own kitchens. Ready-made food from street vendors was common, with beef or pork filling pies and stews. Sheep were also kept for milk, wool, and eventually mutton. After the Norman conquest of 1066, all game belonged to the nobles. Poaching deer or wild boar was punishable by death, though rabbits and hares could still be hunted by peasants. Nobles also kept domesticated rabbits in enclosures called warrens. In fact, Henry III of England once served 500 hares and 200 rabbits at a Christmas feast. In general, meat was a luxury for peasants, especially early in the Middle Ages. Most of their diet consisted of bread and cereals. By the 9th century, almost 3/4 of their food intake came from barley, oats and rye. Interestingly, after the Black Death devastated Europe in 1353, killing about 200 million people, food became much more available. Even the poor could afford more meat. Meanwhile, the rich ate exotic dishes. Recipes called for roasted cats, swans, peacocks, hedgehogs baked in pastry, and meats covered in sauces made of bread, wine and spices. One popular sauce, camelin, was sold ready-made in Paris during the 14th century. Swans were especially prized, often roasted, then redressed in their own feathers for presentation. Fishing was another source of food if the Lord allowed it. Thankfully, nobles preferred meat, so river and stream fishing was often permitted. Peasants living by the sea could fish freely. Salted and pickled fish like herring, mackerel and eel were common. Lampreys, hideous parasitic fish, were a delicacy. Henry I of England supposedly died from overeating them. Christianity heavily influenced eating habits. By the 10th century, fasting was required on Wednesdays, Fridays and Saturdays. No food could be eaten before 3 p.m, later moved to after evening prayers. During Lent, which lasted 40 to 46 days, meat, dairy and eggs were banned, making it a brutal time for hard-working peasants. On Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, no food was allowed at all. Regardless of wealth, bread was the foundation of every diet. Brown bread indicated poverty, since it was cheaper to produce than white bread. Wheat was for the finest loaves. Rye and barley were used for coarser breads. If crops failed, peasants supplemented with peas, beans, even acorns to make horse bread, edible, but barely. In larger towns there were more options, including white bread and fine flour rolls. Unleavened bread was used as plates, called trenchers, during feasts. Once soaked with gravy, trenchers were sometimes eaten or given to the poor. Ale, cider and mead were the main drinks, alongside water from clean rivers, wells, or rain barrels. In towns where clean water was rare, small ale, low-alcohol beer, was drunk even by children. Ale was cheap, calorie-rich, and boosted morale in hard times. By the 13th century, adults drank about 1 gallon of ale a day. Vegetables, referred to generally as herbs, were a vital part of the diet. Common vegetables included carrots, parsnips, cabbages, and beans. Onions, leeks, and garlic were eaten by all classes, but nobles sneered at most other vegetables. Fresh vegetables and fruit were thought to cause disease if eaten raw. Cookbooks warned against salads and uncooked fruit. Thus, vegetables were stewed into soups, and fruits were baked into pies or preserved in honey. Apples, pears, quinces, cherries, strawberries, raspberries, and currants grew wild. Foraging was crucial. Peasants gathered berries, nuts, mushrooms, and wild honey. In mountain regions, chestnuts became dietary staples. Both rich and poor ate pottage, a simple stew made by simmering vegetables and herbs in water or ale. Meat could be added when available. The nobility enjoyed thicker, richer versions of pottage with expensive spices and ingredients known as a mortrue. This dish was thicker, richer, and often included expensive ingredients like saffron, almond milk, and a greater variety of meats. Pottage was a flexible dish. It could be kept simmering for days, with new ingredients added as they became available. For peasants, this meant a near-constant bubbling cauldron of stew, where yesterday's leftovers blended with today's handful of vegetables, or the occasional lucky addition of meat. For those who could afford it, spices like pepper, cinnamon and cloves were highly sought after, and prized additions to food, imported from far-off lands like India and the Middle East. For the average peasant, however, flavouring food meant relying on garden herbs or salt, if they could even get their hands on enough of it. Salt, in fact, was so crucial that it wasn't just for seasoning, it was a vital preservative, used to cure meat and fish so it could last through harsh winters. Salt production was heavily controlled and taxed, meaning it was expensive and sometimes a luxury in itself for poorer families. In terms of sweets, sugar was virtually unknown to most peasants during the early medieval period. Honey was the primary sweetener, and it was highly valued not just for flavouring foods, but also for preserving fruits and even making mead. Beekeeping was a valuable skill, and honeycomb could often be traded for other goods or small luxuries. Cheese was another crucial part of the peasant diet. Milk from cows, goats or sheep was often turned into cheese because fresh milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration. Cheese could be stored longer and provided much-needed protein and fats, especially during periods of fasting when meat was not allowed. Daily meals were basic and practical. A medieval peasant's day might start with a breakfast of rough bread and ale, followed by a midday meal of pottage, and then a light supper. Again probably bread, perhaps some cheese, or cold leftovers from the midday meal. Variety was rare, and meal times were dictated by daylight hours and working schedules rather than by leisure or appetite. Life for the medieval peasant was not only hard but precarious. A poor harvest, a harsh winter, or an outbreak of disease could easily push an already struggling family into starvation. Famines were not uncommon, and malnutrition left people vulnerable to illnesses that today would be easily curable, but were often fatal back then. Despite these hardships, the medieval peasant showed remarkable resilience and ingenuity. And here's something else that made medieval peasant life a little more unpredictable: foraging. When the garden or fields weren't enough, people went scavenging through the woods, hedges and meadows, picking whatever nature tossed their way. Berries, nuts, wild greens like nettles, even mushrooms if they were feeling lucky. Basically, if it didn't immediately kill you, it was dinner. Fish also played a surprisingly big role, not because peasants had fancy lakeside estates, but because the church was extremely fond of banning meat on dozens of fast days every year. When it wasn't allowed to chew on a nice hunk of salted pork, dried fish or freshwater eels were the next best thing. And yes, salted herring was considered a treat. Standards were different back then. Oh, and you might be wondering, why all the ale? It wasn't just because medieval people loved a buzz. It was because their water was often sketchy at best. Brewing ale, even the weak kind peasants drank, killed off most of the nasty stuff, so even toddlers were guzzling down low-alcohol beer with breakfast. Hydration, but make it medieval. Finally, medieval diets changed with the seasons. Summer meant fresh veggies and occasional fruit if you were lucky, while winter meals were a grim festival of dried beans, hard cheese, salted meat, and pottage that had seen better days. They weren't eating the same thing all year round. They were eating whatever hadn't rotted yet. But somehow, through a mix of foraging, brewing, salting, fasting, and just pure stubbornness, medieval peasants managed to survive and even carve out some good moments, usually involving communal feasts after a hard harvest, where for one evening nobody worried about tomorrow's dinner. Until tomorrow came, of course. And while their diets were limited compared to today's standards, they were largely natural, unprocessed and seasonal, a kind of simple, earthy cuisine that, ironically, many modern people today might find themselves striving for under the label of organic or farm to table. Clowns, buffoons, fools, jesters, jokers, of one kind or another, have been part of the history of almost every culture in civilization. The comic actors of the Roman Empire are probably the direct predecessors of the jesters of the Middle Ages. Although there were no professional jokers at that time, comic actors are likely to have been the forerunners in both their style of comedy and attire. Many Roman emperors decided to rid their empire of actors, claiming them to be damaging to society. Whilst fleeing persecution, those performers spread their trade all over Europe, possibly leading to the development of the jester in later years. Although it should be noted that jesters were prevalent in other countries such as China and India, the wish to be entertained and the need to laugh was, and still is, universal. During the medieval period, lucky jesters were the ones who were employed by nobles or royalty to perform at court. But he or she wasn't just an entertainer. They were part of the social fabric of a region. Court jesters were valued with great privileges. Let's travel back in time and take a look at the life of a medieval jester. Welcome to medieval madness. Between the 12th and 17th centuries, the term minstrel, meaning little servant or gleeman, described any person who was a professional entertainer of any sort. This included acrobats, jugglers, and even storytellers, but more specifically, musicians. During the Middle Ages, many of these minstrels toured from place to place, staying for a short time in a town or village whilst business was good. Although some of the most talented and well-respected were permanently employed at the royal court or by other rich households, whilst they were able to command a high salary, these minstrels could be found across the whole of Europe. In France, they were known as jongleurs or troubadours. In Germany, minnesingers. They were called skops in England, skalds in Scandinavia, and bards in Ireland. Travelling from place to place, they not only provided a source of entertainment with their ballads and stories, but also served as a way of delivering the news. Information from the villagers would be shared with the minstrel, who would impart this news to the townsfolk in the next village they performed at. During the period of the Middle Ages, a person's station in life was governed by the family that they were born into. A blacksmith would teach his sons how to be blacksmiths, as with a stonemason. A peasant would remain in the lowest social rank. But the European jester could come from any background. There might be a clerk whose fooling around had amused a noble, a cottager who was known for their wit and joke-telling, or even an ex-monk who had been expelled from the abbey for their antics. It wasn't easy being a jester. It was a job that required intelligence and quick-wittedness. A fantastic memory was essential for memorising epic poetry, heroic stories, or even just the news that you spread between villages. There was also a need to be able to improvise and adapt depending on the audience. Children would want to hear pretty lullabies, whilst older people would prefer a retelling of some bloody war story or another. Tact was also a requirement. A jester needed to appear whenever needed but fade into the background when required, a skill in itself. Jesters were given free rein to say whatever they liked, but they had to be careful not to upset too many people or go too far. There were two sorts of fools, natural and artificial or licensed. Either way, those that had physical deformities, such as misshapen limbs, hunched backs, or exceptionally ugly faces, were particularly valued, as were dwarfs. They used their physical appearance to their advantage to gain extra laughs. There are stories of natural fools being recruited from poor families as they were thought to have been touched by God. A disabled child or adult would be a huge financial burden to a peasant family, and it would have been a great help to have them taken on and cared for by a wealthy one. The fool would be unpaid but provided with clothes, bed and board. Once these poor souls were no longer amusing to the household, they were cast out. Although some were given alms regularly, most sadly ended their days as beggars. The tradition of having a fool at court dates back much further than the Middle Ages. They were employed not just for entertainment, but also to ease the mental pressures for both the monarch and his nobles. In this way, the jester would help their employer to focus better on their duties and political affairs. By the end of the 12th century, the name fool began to be used when describing a jester who had earned payment in the manner of land, as well as the freedom to leave court, although they did have to agree to return as and when required. During the medieval period, court jesters were held in great esteem, especially in the royal household. This prized position meant that they could tease their patron without causing too much offence, often speaking the harsh truth to their superiors disguised as humour. This ability was known as the jester's privilege, and although people laughed at their silly stories, they also listened to the truths hidden within. Underneath the folly was usually a lot of common sense and cleverness. It was a complex job that required much thoughtfulness, insight and discretion, as the jester of Philip VI of France found out in 1340. Edward III of England defeated the fleet of the French king Philip VI at Sluys. Of course, no one wanted to give Philip the bad news. It was left up to his fool, who, once in the king's presence, was heard to mumble, "Those cowardly Englishmen, those chicken-hearted cowards." How so?" asked the king. "Why? Because they had not courage enough to jump into the sea like your own sailors, who went headlong from your ships, leaving them to the enemy who did not dare to follow them." Court was often controlled by fear and insincerity, and it was essential that the truth be dressed up as silliness, in order for it to be accepted. It's impossible to know how many crazy ideas a jester had discouraged by whispering into the king's ear, or how many calamities were caused because of his bad advice. As far as physical entertainment went, singing, dancing, acrobatics and juggling were all indispensable skills for the jester, as well as being able to play an instrument, perform ventriloquism, puppetry and sleight of hand. Even when carrying out their main job, that of making their employer laugh, part of the comic appeal of the jester was their traditional costume, which was also meant to cause amusement. During the early medieval period, it was not unusual for the head to be completely shaved. Then they would wear a hat with the ears of a donkey on top of their head. Some would also wear a donkey's tail as well. Later, a cowl was worn, similar to that of a monk, which would fall off onto the shoulders to give them a comical look. This hood was usually topped off with a coxcomb. The comb of a rooster, which was traditionally used to adorn a fool's headpiece. By the late medieval age, the hat had evolved. Made from soft cloth, it now had 3 points, representing the ass's ears worn in the earlier period. A jingling bell was fastened onto the end of each point. Called the cap and bell, this is the design that we associate with a fool's hat today. They might also carry a type of pretend sceptre known as a bauble or marotte, with a carved miniature grinning head on the end. It would often be made to look like the jester themselves, and was also adorned with a cap and bell. Some fools carried a mock weapon such as a wooden sword, an inflated bladder on a stick filled with peas to make a type of large rattle, or a padded club. These types of props were used to add extra quirkiness to their cavorting. A motley coat or tunic was worn, made from bright mismatched colours such as red and green or yellow and blue. This was meant to highlight a lack of symmetry and give emphasis to the mayhem and unpredictability of the fool. Many also had bells around the skirt or at the elbow so that the jester could be heard tinkling wherever they went. Bi-coloured, tightly fitting breeches and stockings were worn on the legs. The whole outfit was usually designed by the fool themselves and had to be maintained regularly. In contrast, the natural fool would usually be dressed in a long gown. The role of messenger was also part of the job description, for a personal jester to a king or nobleman. They would go into battle with their master and the rest of the troops and deliver messages to the opposing side, such as terms of surrender or conditions for the liberation of hostages. Jesters were traditionally thought to be sacred, and it was customary for them not to be harmed in any way. But that was not always the case. If the message happened to be something that the opposing army did not want to hear, it would be the fool that suffered the consequences. It was not unusual for the angry leader to shoot the messenger right back at the enemy by loading him into a catapult or trebuchet. It was to be hoped that the jester would have already been killed beforehand, and that it was their severed head that would fire back. But sometimes, unfortunately, it was a live fool that was sent airborne. However, one minstrel who showed himself to be more than just the average jester was the Norman dwarf named Taillefer. He was a French jongleur who travelled over from France with William the Conqueror during the Norman conquest. By mid-battle, the French were becoming weary and in danger of defeat. On horseback, Taillefer juggled a sword while singing the Song of Roland at the English troops during the Battle of Hastings. His antics caused one English soldier to break ranks from the shield wall. Taillefer saw his opportunity and attacked the Englishman, decapitating him. He then charged at the English line, killing more enemies before he was overcome. Taillefer is credited with lifting the spirits of the French army, which then rallied and won the battle, and subsequently the kingdom. And he is not the only jester of note. Many were quite powerful and had great influence throughout medieval society. Roland the Farter was court jester to King Henry II of England in the 12th century. Actually an accomplished flautist, he was famous for the art of breaking wind, and was especially sought after during Henry's Christmas festivities. There, the charmingly named jester would perform a simultaneous fart, whistle, and jump. Roland was so well respected by his king that he was rewarded with the 30-acre Hemingstone Manor, as well as an annual payment. At the court of Edward I, known as Longshanks, Tom the Fool was awarded the huge sum of 50 shillings because he performed so well at the wedding of Princess Elizabeth. Many others were also able to take advantage of their position and turn their good fortune into wealth, helping to obtain profitable deals and jobs for friends and family. Another jester who was determined to make the most of his skills was Rahere. Using his wit, he became invaluable to the nobility and was referred to as a minstrel. He was particularly good at making fun of people and spreading outrageous gossip behind their backs, amusing everyone who was listening. Not only did he perform clerical work, but he also became jester to King Henry I in the early 1100s. Rahere would at times adopt the behaviour of an idiot, which greatly entertained the servants and children. He is reported to have fallen ill on a pilgrimage to Rome, where he had a vision of St. Bartholomew. On his return to London, he founded the hospital of the same name to create a sanctuary for those less fortunate. In China, Shenjiangoa, also known as gradually stretching taller, was employed as a jester during the 10th century in the state of southern Tang. He was so influential that he was able to make the emperor Li Bian reduce taxes. In the midst of a drought, he made a joke that even the rain was afraid of being taxed and would not come into the land. Li Bian was so amused that he cut taxes immediately. Legend has it that that very night Shen is also believed to have saved the emperor's life. Li Bian invited his enemies, Al Ben, to a banquet, then sneaked poison into a goblet of wine before he offered it to Li Bian for a toast. Shen quickly grabbed the cup and, sacrificing himself for his emperor, drank the poisoned wine himself. Despite being given an antidote, sadly, Shen died from a burst brain. Whereas, in Saxony, Germany, rather than being looked at as a clown, Klausner was regarded as being a wise man during the late 15th century. Much was written about him, and he was known for his moral stories and parables. He's even thought to have been able to predict the future. During the Middle Ages, women were considered the property of their fathers or husbands, and had very few privileges. But some were lucky enough to become successful as jesters. For them it meant they had the freedom to insult men of power without consequence. The job was one of the few that was completely open to women, who could enjoy the same benefits as men without any stigma. Many female jesters accompanied the queens and ladies of court, such as Archerwood de Poix, who was fool to Jeanne, the Queen of Charles I of France, in 1373. We know that Jeanne paid the large amount of 170 gold francs for a dress for Archerwood, who was obviously well cared for. Another female jester was Madame d'Or, who entertained everybody at the Festival of the Golden Fleece in 1429 in Bruges de Belgium. Margaret, the granddaughter of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, also had a female fool who was allowed to sit in a chariot with the ladies in waiting when travelling with her mistress. One nameless female jester arrived at the court of Edward II, who was celebrating the festival of Whitsuntide at the Hall of Westminster in 1316. She trotted into the hall on a horse and rode around telling jokes to the king and his eminent guests. At the end of her performance, she approached the king and placed a letter in his hand before graciously riding away. The letter actually contained a petition of complaint against the abundant favour that the king had lavished upon the undeserving, while his faithful knights and trusty servants were neglected. No one else would have dared to hand over this letter, but jesters were allowed free access everywhere. Perhaps this female fool was also aware of King Edward's love of any joker who could ride a horse, or to be more precise, could fall off of a horse. He previously paid one jester who continually tumbled from his mount the princely sum of 20 shillings, double that of another fool who could only dance for his king. Some of the customs that we now enjoy during the Christmas period date back to the Middle Ages and before. Singing carols, giving gifts, decorating homes, and overindulging were all part of the medieval festivities. The Lord of Misrule was a respected position within noble houses and at the royal court. The jester would be expected to play the role over Christmas. It was a demanding job. Festivities needed to be organised properly to guarantee that everything went well, and the reign of the Lord of Misrule could last anywhere from 12 days to 3 months. There were masked parties, the possession of the Yule log, and feasts that all needed to be planned. Sometimes the festivities would include mummers' plays. The origins of mumming date even further back than the Middle Ages, through Europe and into Russia. Medieval mummers were a group of travelling actors who would perform religious plays at Christmas, travelling from house to house. Most of the plays had a biblical theme, but were mainly for entertainment. So the medieval jester was valued, not just endured. Their relationship with the townsfolk and those at court was often warm and friendly. Ever the diplomat, they were the voice of reason for many monarchs who were brought up to believe that they had divine rights and were answerable to no one except God. They could save an innocent from the king's fury with just the telling of a joke, therefore saving the king from himself. Although their verbal attacks could be scathing, there was usually an undercurrent of compassion and real insight. The fool was on the side of the ordinary people, fighting against oppression, making them liked by all, whether lord or peasant. Welcome to ancient China, Shang Dynasty. If you're feeling OG, Han Dynasty if you want to feel slightly fancier while still living a life of constant fear and splinters. Now pick your character. Farmer, merchant, scholar or noble. Doesn't really matter. You're still waking up miserable. If you're a farmer, congratulations. You woke up at 4 a.m. to the sound of your neighbour coughing up a lung because life expectancy is a generous, maybe 35 if you're lucky. Your bed? It's not really a bed. It's a pile of straw, vaguely shaped like disappointment. You crawl out from under your itchy, bug-infested blanket, step into your mud floor house, and immediately smash your foot into a sharp rock. Good morning, pain. Breakfast? If you're rich, you're not. Maybe some millet porridge. If you're normal, it's rice. If you're unlucky, it's yesterday's cold rice, with a side of sadness. Then it's straight to the fields to work 12 hours bending over in soul-crushing humidity. Also, the local lord can collect 90% of your harvest and say, "Good job, peasant. Here's a lovely backhand to the face. No days off, no weekends, no self-care Sundays. Just dirt, sweat, and hope that the next flood doesn't wash away your entire existence. Yay, farming. If you're a merchant, ooh, fancy. You have money. You wake up on an actual bed. It's still hard as a rock, but at least it's not covered in bugs. You stretch, put on your linen robes, which by the way scream "I'm doing well" louder than a modern guy renting a Lambo for Instagram, and you start thinking about how to hustle some bamboo scrolls, silk or fermented fish sauce. But don't get cocky, because in ancient China, merchants were considered just slightly more respectable than pickpockets and people who talk during movies. The scholars and nobles see you and immediately need to rinse their eyeballs, even though they secretly need your stuff. Hypocrisy in my ancient civilization. Groundbreaking. Breakfast. Slightly better rice. Maybe even dumplings if you're rolling in it. Still, you'll probably spend the morning calculating how much profit you can make before the next local official decides to tax you at sword point. If you're a scholar, alright nerd, you wake up in a slightly nicer house, because literacy is your superpower. And by superpower, I mean you can read, write, and memorize complicated Confucian rules about how to bow correctly or how not to breathe wrong in front of a noble. Morning routine? You pray, you meditate, you recite your favourite passages about filial piety, because ancient China was 70% about respecting your parents and 30% about inventing weird punishments if you didn't. Then you polish your calligraphy brushes because looking good while writing about virtue is a full-time job. Breakfast? Rice. Always rice. Maybe a chicken egg if you're fancy. If you're really high up, maybe some pickled veggies that have been soaking since the last emperor's cousin got exiled for blinking wrong at a banquet. Then you spend the day teaching, copying texts, or, if you're lucky, climbing the bureaucratic ladder, which is a lot like climbing a ladder covered in oil while people throw rocks at you. So, fun. If you're a noble. First off, you're not even waking up yourself. Some poor servant is awkwardly clearing their throat by your bedside like, sir? Time to exist. Your bed. It's actually made of wood, but it's lacquered and has dragon carvings, so it feels impressive. You throw on some silk robes embroidered with symbols of cosmic authority that basically scream, "Bow down to me, peasants, for I have not touched mud in 3 generations." Breakfast? A literal feast. Rice, meats, fruits, imported from God knows where, and teas brewed with water that was probably filtered better than modern city tap. You casually munch while thinking about how you're technically supposed to be virtuous and humble, while wearing 20 pounds of jewellery. Then it's either deal with imperial court politics, aka trying not to get assassinated before lunch, oversee massive projects like canal digging, where thousands might die, or host poetry contests where losing could mean a loss of face worse than actual death. Good times. Alright, you've survived the waking up part. Congrats. Now it's time for breakfast, lunch and dinner, also known as the 3 daily reminders that you're one bad harvest away from eating your belt. Eating in ancient China was basically a game of how much rice can you eat before you remember you can't afford anything else. If you were lucky, you got porridge. Rice porridge if you were in the south, millet porridge if you were up north. Either way, it tasted like sadness and bland hopes for a better afterlife. Some days, if your ancestors were smiling on you and the rats didn't eat everything during the night, you might get a boiled vegetable or two. Maybe some cabbage. Maybe some wild garlic if you were feeling spicy. Maybe a fish so small it blinked twice before dying of embarrassment on your plate. And listen, you think you know tough cuts of meat. They were eating organ stew out here. Intestines, liver, mystery lumps with the veins still attached. You didn't ask what it was. You just chewed aggressively and thanked the gods you had anything at all. Meanwhile, if you were rich, and by rich I mean has shoes that match, your meal started looking a little better. Rice still, yes, because it's China and that's the law, but with side dishes, pickled cucumbers, dried tofu skins, duck eggs that had been salted until they tasted like a savoury punch to the face. And if you were really rolling in that ancient cash, meat, pork belly that dripped grease like a dream, roasted duck with the crisp skin crackling just right, and soups, endless, bubbling cauldrons of herbal soup that could cure anything except the crushing weight of dynastic politics. Oh, and then there were the weirder moments. You think modern food trends are weird? These people were already on their flexitarian, paleo-organic, local-sourced journey before it was cool. Alchemists were out there grinding jade into powder and mixing it into tea like, this tastes like extremely expensive stomach cancer. Some genius decided mercury was good for you. Yeah, mercury. The same stuff that nowadays you wouldn't touch without gloves and therapy. Fun fact, if your local physician told you to drink a potion made of ground deer antler, bear bile, and something vaguely described as mystical mountain essence, you just did it. Because arguing with the town doctor was a great way to wake up with no kidneys. And of course, there was tea. Tea was the one pure thing. Rich, poor, scholar, merchant, random guy selling snakeskin belts on the corner. Everybody drank tea. Sometimes it was literally just boiled water with a leaf floating in it. But still, tea. The real MVP. So, yeah, food in ancient China was either enough to keep you moving, or enough to make you write a 30-stanza poem about how full you feel. There was no in-between, and let's be honest, if you lived back then, you'd either be gnawing on a root and pretending it was cake, or laying back in silk robes, eating plums imported from somewhere so far away that someone probably died bringing them to you. Either way, you'd still die young, bloated with pride, or just bloated. Okay, you've dragged yourself out of bed. You've eaten your soggy bowl of congratulations, it's porridge. Now what? Welcome to the Daily Grind Ancient China edition, and let me be very clear, nobody was having fun. If you were lucky, and by lucky, I mean your family hadn't been crushed by tax collectors yet. You spent your day farming, and farming in ancient China wasn't just plant seed, water plant, look inspirational under the sunrise. Number it was back-breaking, mud-slogging, worm-punching, sun-blinding labour, from the second your bowl hit the floor to the second your face hit the bed again at night. You woke up before the rooster. You planted rice seedlings knee-deep in swampy water that smelled like every bad decision made in a 10-mile radius. You fought off mosquitoes the size of small birds. You bent over so much that your spine just gave up one day and turned into a question mark, and heaven help you if a drought came, or a flood, or locusts, or a noble riding by on a horse so shiny it reflected your poverty back at you like a mirror, demanding more taxes. You didn't own the land you farmed, you borrowed it from somebody richer, who borrowed it from somebody even richer, who prayed nightly that you stayed alive just long enough to finish paying off your great-great-grandfather's debt. Now, say you weren't a farmer, Maybe you were a merchant. Maybe you thought, hey, selling stuff sounds easier than fighting riverworms with my bare hands. It was easier. If by easier you mean walking 100 miles through bandit-infested mountains with a backpack full of overpriced silk scarves, hoping not to get stabbed for your troubles. You had no trucks, no Uber Eats, no shipping labels. You had your sandals, your brittle knees, and your irrational optimism. Markets were chaos. Sellers screaming prices, customers screaming for discounts, chickens screaming because someone dropped them. Half the day was bargaining over a single copper coin. The other half was trying not to get pickpocketed by a 12-year-old with faster hands than fate itself. And if you were successful, if you actually made money, congratulations. Now you were a target for corrupt officials who could invent a tax out of thin air. Oh, you're selling rugs? New law? Rug tax? Hand it over. Meanwhile, scholars were living a completely different nightmare. People imagined being a scholar was glamorous, sipping tea under peach trees, writing poems about the clouds. Wrong. You were cramming for exams harder than a modern student jacked up on caffeine and existential dread. The imperial exams, the ones that decided if you got a cushy government job or spent the rest of your life teaching reluctant 8-year-olds, were brutal. They tested your memory, your handwriting, your poetry skills, your knowledge of Confucian classics, and probably how well you could cry without smudging the ink. Fail once, study harder, fail twice. Hope your parents still love you. Fail 3 times. Congratulations, you're now a tutor making less than a rice farmer. And if, by some miracle, you passed, you'd get a job sitting behind a low desk in a dim room, transcribing tax records, reading memorials to the emperor that nobody cared about, and praying your superior didn't frame you for embezzlement just to earn promotion points. Now, the nobles, the top dogs, you'd think they had it easy, sort of, but also, not really. Yes, they had silk robes. Yes, they had feasts with duck and wine and whatever weird animal the hunters dragged home that week. But they were stuck playing the world's most stressful game of Survivor, Palace Edition. One wrong word at a bank